A major cause of the Korean War was the permanent division of Korea. The war ended with a ceasefire, but there was no permanent peace treaty. A ceasefire is a temporary suspension of fighting, a truce. The effect of the war created a heavily weaponized border zone, which is the 38th parallel. This border is still heavily guarded by both North and South Korea today. There was no hope for reunification, as the peninsula was permanently divided. To confirm their separation, they both had different leaders and governing methods. North Korea remained under communist rule, and South Korea formed into a successful democratic, non-communist, and capitalist nation. The Korean War also created consequences for increased tensions between many nations. The war intensified the Cold War and extended it beyond Europe. Korea marked the militarization of the Cold War. This is a quote said by Oliver Edwards. It also heightened US fears of further Soviet Union aggression. This was because they were the two superpowers of the Korean War. The war also increased tension between China and the Soviet Union. This was because they squabbled over who should be responsible for paying the bill of all the damages that were caused. Another major consequence of the Korean War was the decreased birth rate in Korea. This graph shows the time of the economic crisis after the Korean War in Korea. The birth rate got low as people pursued having money for themselves rather than having money to pay for children. Since 6 million men were wounded, injured, and dead, this also heavily decreased the birth rate in Korea. The Korean War also created many consequences on the USA, some being good and some being bad. Many US soldiers died and 36,568 were missing. The Korean War also extended the Truman Doctrine and containment to Asia. The Truman Doctrine was a US foreign policy to prevent the spread of communism throughout the Cold War, and the containment to Asia was a policy that gave poor countries affected by warfare economic aid. There was also an enlargement of the USA's military around the world. By 1955, the USA had 450 bases in 36 countries. The war changed the US's view on third world countries, most notably in Indochina, helping them with financial problems. The war also helped them to form new policies with other countries, and for their own country. It allowed them to sign the Treaty of San Francisco with Japan, which allowed them to build a US military base in Japan. Another major consequence of the Korean War was the economic consequences created. 70% of the textiles industry, 70% of the chemical industry, 40% of the agricultural machinery industry, and 10% of the rubber industry were destroyed after the Korean War ended in Korea. 600,000 houses, 500 kilometers worth of roads, and 1,453 bridges were also destroyed and had to be rebuilt and paid for in Korea. The total damage of the Korean War in Korea was $6.9 billion, which is equivalent to 22,574 million kwon. This put them in serious economic damage and led to serious inflammation. As of this graph, we can see the amount of people that were injured, wounded, or missing that got involved in the war. 1.5 million North Koreans were wounded, and over 6 million soldiers, sailors, and airmen fought on both sides of the Korean War.